Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for QI Power Hour. My name is Tracy Sharon with the Saskatchewan Health Quality Council. For those of you who might be joining QI Power Hour for the first time, it is a free monthly webinar learning series hosted by the Health Quality Council, where we bring together improvers from a variety of sectors with an interest in improving health and healthcare, and to learn about quality improvement related topics. I am joining you today from HQC's offices in Saskatoon on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis people. Our organization also serves the entire province of Saskatchewan, which also includes lands within Treaties 2, 4, 5, 8, and 10 as well. And recognizing that this land we call home is home to a diverse range of cultures and groups, including the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota. And we pay respect to the treaties and the obligations of those treaties on all of us as inhabitants of these treaty lands. And we're committed to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I'd like to share with you that this session is being recorded and will be available on HQC's website following the session. So if you missed something, feel free to go back and listen to the recording or recommend it to your friends. And while you're there, feel free to check out past QI Power Hour sessions as well. You can find them all on our website. While you're there, you can also sign up for our QI Power Hour email newsletter, where you can receive notices about upcoming sessions and details on how to register straight to your inbox. Over the years, we've been excited to see the continued growth of our QI Power Hour sessions throughout our home province of Saskatchewan, across Canada, and around the world. Thank you for choosing to spend an hour of your time with us today and for your commitment to ongoing learning to improve the systems that you all are a part of. A very important tool on our session today will be the chat function on WebEx. Please make lots of use of that to share your comments, your questions, and your ideas. If you're unsure of where that is, there's a little speech bubble on your screen. You click on that, and then you can enter things into the chat. I will be monitoring that throughout so that we can pull any questions from there in our Q&A session at the end. So please feel free to enter your questions and comments as we go through the session. So now, without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our friend and colleague, Doug Campbell, to talk about breaking down wicked problems and a tool that we know and love here at HQC, the driver diagram, that will help us do that. So Doug is part of the strategy and innovation team within the Saskatchewan Health Authority. His team focuses on using performance measurement to support strategic planning, track the progress of strategic initiatives, and identify opportunities for improvement within the health system. In his role as director, he works with other SHA portfolios and health system partner organizations to turn data into information for decision makers. His background is in biomedical engineering, and he currently resides in Saskatoon with his partner Jen and 3-year-old son Boston. Welcome, Doug, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tracy. I very much appreciate it, and it's nice to be back. I think this is actually my fifth QI Power Hour, which is kind of crazy when I think back on it. So it's exciting to see how far it's come and the reach that you've had as a team that puts this together, and I'm very excited to be a part of it again. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction. Okay. So what we are going to talk about today is the tool of the driver diagram and how it can be used to break down what we call wicked problems, or problems that are really hard to kind of wrap your head around and grasp. So we initially did a presentation on driver diagrams about 6 years ago, and Chelsea Schwartz from HCC reached out to me and said, "Hey, I think it's time for a refresh. Would you mind coming back?" And I said, "Yes, absolutely." So if you were with me 6 years ago, some of the content will feel kind of familiar because the concept is the same, but I've tried to build in a few new things about how we're actually using them within the Health Authority to move some of our larger projects forward. So Tracy did an excellent land acknowledgement at the start, so I will skip parts of it, but I do want to acknowledge I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 here in Saskatoon, the homeland of the Métis. And what this means to me is that I've been trying to improve my knowledge in this area over the last year roughly. So I took the Indigenous Studies course through the University of Alberta. That's a free course for anyone to take, and I very highly recommend it. It was honestly really eye-opening to me how little I knew about some of the history of Canada and the peoples that resided here first. One of the things that really stood out to me and has been a takeaway that I'm still trying to learn more about is the culture that they have of using storytelling to be their teaching mechanism. So this presentation is very much in a style that I kind of grew up learning of here's the material and I'll talk through it with you. It seemed very much like as I learned through that course and through the opportunities that I've had to listen to some of our elders speak within the health authority, their method of using stories to impart that same kind of information is a skill that I just don't have and I'm trying to learn. So perhaps if I get the chance to come back and do another QI Power Hour, maybe I'll try and do it in a different way where we can use some storytelling to tell that same information instead of this kind of didactic learning that I'm used to. So that was my big takeaway from that course. But there were absolutely many, many takeaways, so I highly recommend it. I also wanted to take an opportunity because strategy and innovation is a new portfolio to the Saskatchewan Health Authority. Technically, we're 3.5 years old, but it kind of felt like we were derailed for a couple of years there by COVID, where our entire portfolio was supporting strategic initiatives related to our COVID planning, surge planning, service resumption, service slowdowns. And we didn't really get to focus on the work that we actually were hired to do. We had to support other things, which again was very important, very happy to be doing it. But now that we've been given the opportunity to come back together as a team, fill out our specialist roles, we're just starting to get our feet under us again about who we are and what we do. So I want to take a couple minutes to say this is where we see ourselves as a portfolio, and we're always open to opportunities to collaborate and work with others if you see some opportunities where we can work together. So this is the mission, vision, and values of the Health Authority as a whole, and our portfolio and strategy and innovation as a support portfolio is really about helping other portfolios achieve these mission, vision, and values. So being safe, accountable, respectful, working in collaboration, having compassion. We try and support that through the strategic planning processes, through the information and data that we share, through being innovative, through supporting large scale change. But we don't actually deliver service. We support those that do. So I'll give you a bit of a view over where we do see ourselves. So there's kind of 5 key parts to where our portfolio thinks we can contribute and be partners to our organization and others. So my director title is Director of Strategy and Innovation, Performance Measurement. So this is kind of my area that it's up on the screen. So the work that we do is really around identifying areas for improvement or areas that we're doing really well so that we can feed them into the strategic planning process and then support portfolios to move work ahead to achieve some of those outcomes that we want to see in the way that our healthcare system performs. There's a different portfolio led by Carrie Lynn Voigt and a smaller portion of that that's led by Rodi Yakubowski around innovation and spread. And this is a team that's very much just starting to pull together exactly what their plan is and what they want to achieve. And that might actually be a really good future QI Power Hour to have them come and say, this is how we see innovation in the SHA, and this is what we're currently working on. So they're looking for opportunities within the organization to spread best practice, as well as looking to other industries and outside of the SHA to say, what are you working on and how can we bring that in? And the part that Rhoda and her team oversee is part of the Can Health Network, which is a Canada-wide innovation network in healthcare, trying to, again, improve healthcare outcomes. So that's still kind of new and in development, but I'm excited to see where it goes. We see ourselves as helping to guide and partner in transformational change initiatives. So this is a portfolio that's led by Adrienne Danilou. A lot of the work that they're focused on right now is around partnership in health network development. So her specialists are very much embedded with the EDs of primary healthcare and the directors of primary healthcare as they go through information and make decisions on who are the people in our networks, what are the services that they need, and then how can we support them to actually get those decisions made and those services up and running. The 4th part that we see ourselves in is around strategic planning, of course. So in strategy and innovation, strategic planning is a very key part of that. This portfolio is led by Robin Schenner. They design the processes that we use. They work with all of our executive leadership team and senior leadership team to say, here's some of the goals from the ministry, here's some of the internal goals from Andrew and Derek at the CEO and COO level, and how do we build that out over the year? And we actually just recently launched our SHA strategic roadmap, which lays out our vision for where we want the organization to go over the year. We've got some year-long outcomes, and then we've done some really good scoping to say these are the things that we want to achieve in Q1, and that was really led by Robin's team. And of course, we can't do any of this without partnership. So this is kind of the big foundation of all of the work that we do is as a support portfolio, we need to work with our partners within the organization, but also outside. So working closely with the Ministry of Health to achieve some of the goals of the government, working with the Health Quality Council around some of the data and research that they do and how we can pull that in. And of course, trying to learn from eHealth and 3S Health around their processes because they've got really strong strategic planning processes that we try and borrow from as well. So as a portfolio, that's kind of where we see ourselves, and I figured I would take the opportunity to showcase that now that we've got a few people on the line listening. So who am I? This is me up on the screen. So Tracy read through kind of the Cliff Note bio of who I am, but the main thing of me as a person is up there in the corner. So that's Jen and our little guy Boston, and they're awesome. They spend tons of time outside together. As you can see, we're outside on a walk on a winter day. Boston loves it outside. He loves swimming and gymnastics, and he thinks he's going to play baseball and golf this summer, which makes me super excited. So kind of at the core of who I am is being best friends with those two, and they keep me busy, which is awesome. My work is, as I've kind of mentioned, in the performance measurement side of things. So there's a snapshot up there on the screen of a health system indicator and a performance measurement cascade that comes out of it. And that's a big part of the work that we do is working with digital health to look through all kinds of data, pick out key themes, get that into the planning process, and get that in front of our key decision makers. I've had the incredible privilege to have a lot of education throughout my life, and I definitely thank the Health Quality Council for lots of that. The one thing I do want to kind of call out there is I had the opportunity to spend 4 months learning with Intermountain Healthcare, which is one of the best health systems in the world, in my opinion. And Brent James was the leader of that program, and I got to spend a lot of time with him, learning from him. And he's kind of one of those guys that if you had a Mount Rushmore of who's who in the measurement world in healthcare, he would absolutely be on that Mount Rushmore. And when I think back on it, he had incredible slide decks and all kinds of information, but he was one of those leaders that used storytelling, and I didn't even recognize it at the time. Of he would have slides and he was kind of going through them, but he would just stand and talk and could tell stories about projects that he'd worked on and ingrain some of those concepts and learnings that he wanted to impart to us without just saying, hey, here's the key bullets on the slide. And so again, if I'm kind of ever going to model myself after someone in my career, I think he's a pretty good North Star to learn from, of expert in measurement and expert in leadership, but a really good storyteller and really good at doing knowledge translation. And then some of the other stuff outside of work that I really like is around exploration and space exploration and underwater exploration. So there's a couple pictures of me there. I lived for 14 days at the Mars Desert Research Station, which is the picture on the left, and that's a real picture of me in a kind of mocked up spacesuit walking through an area that's devoid of vegetation, totally gray, so it kind of looks like you're walking on the moon, which is nuts. And then on the right side, I lived underwater for 5 days doing research. So that was actually me getting my brain scanned midway through our mission to see what was happening to my brain function compared to before we'd gone underwater, and we checked it again after being underwater. So I've got to do some pretty cool things along the way, but feel very fortunate for those opportunities that I've had and happy to share some of the learnings with this group. Okay, so now into the actual meat of the QI Power Hour. So what is a wicked problem and what do they look like in healthcare? And I'm actually going to ask the folks that are attending today what you think those wicked problems are in healthcare, if you want to start thinking through them as I go through these characteristics of what they are. So a wicked problem is something that is really hard to kind of wrap your head around and say, this is the exact problem, and I think this is exactly how I would solve it. There's lots of factors in what makes them occur and how you might actually go about solving it. They tend to change once you think you have a good definition of part of it. Either you need to move on to figuring out the other part of the problem, and by the time you figured out that part, the initial part that you thought you had a grasp on has probably changed. It's like trying to grab a balloon that's not quite filled up, and you think you can take a really good grasp of this one part over here, and then take a good grasp of the other part, and suddenly there's other parts of the balloon that are kind of going all over the map. That's what a wicked problem is like in my mind. It's this thing that as you try and grab it, it keeps changing shape in your hands. So there are some characteristics to understand if you're working in one of these, and really it means it's a problem that just isn't a simple, straightforward solution. You need to come at it from a lot of different ways and a lot of different partnerships. So as I mentioned, they're kind of difficult to clearly define. So you can say poverty is absolutely a wicked problem, but how do we define it? What are the things that cause it? And there's so many pieces to that. It makes it a really hard thing to just scope into a nice little bubble to say, I can wrap my hands around this. I can say, this is what poverty is, and this is how I would solve it. So it's big, tough things like that. It has many interdependencies and is often multi-causal. So for example, climate change. This is one of those things that, again, tons of factors affecting it. They're all interdependent. And if you think you can solve one of them, you might kind of sub-optimize a different part of it, which is the third part of the characteristics. So solving one problem might actually lead to unforeseen problems down the road. So again, in this climate change example, if we want to reduce reliance on oil and gas and move toward more electric vehicles, great. But part of that means we need to find more rare earth metals, we need to mine them, and maybe that has a different impact on the earth that also starts affecting climate change. So you solved one problem and maybe you created a different problem. They're not stable, so you can't just say, I need to fix this, and it's always going to be that same problem that you're looking at. Um, Again, with the climate change example, maybe you're trying to solve 10, 20 years ago the hole in the ozone layer, and now the ice caps are melting, or there's more forest fires. There's always something new that's kind of popped up related to climate change, and it's really hard to keep a good strategy on how to actually solve some of those problems. Because of that, there's not really a clear solution, and you need to come at it from lots of ways. People need to be involved in them, and it's never just one person or one organization's problem to solve. So whether it's poverty and you need to work with justice and social services and finance and healthcare to actually support folks that are living below the poverty line, that line of responsibility never just lands with one person or one organization. So as you can tell, they're really kind of difficult things to solve and wrap your head around. So I kind of gave you the heads up we were going to be talking about it, but I'm curious if you've got thoughts on what those wicked problems are. Put them in the chat and let me kind of know what you're thinking about healthcare, some of the things you've experienced, and what you would see as a wicked problem within healthcare. And I'll pause for a second to see what the thoughts are. Staff shortages, absolutely. ED wait times. It's almost like you know what's coming in the presentation. Awesome. Yeah, very much so. Jason, I know you've worked on antimicrobial stewardship for years, basically since like the first day I was at HQC. I remember going to a presentation you give. So yeah, absolutely. Lots of really, really good examples in the chat there. So as you can tell, as we all know, healthcare is extremely complex, and this is why there isn't simple solutions. It's a really complex business, and COVID has only added another layer of complexity to all those problems that we knew existed. So yeah, thank you very much for putting your thoughts in the chat. And you're right, they are all very much wicked problems. So one of the tools we can use to try and wrap our head around possible solutions to those problems is the driver diagram. And not to say it's the perfect tool, but in my mind, it's a way of visualizing the way you think you can attack some of those problems. So what a driver diagram really is that tool for organizing your thoughts into action. It is a visual representation of the change you want to make, and it's kind of a logic model to say, I think if I do this, it will impact this, which might impact that, which will ultimately achieve the goal that I want to achieve. It becomes a really good tool for engagement because it's now a visual concept that you can put in front of someone, you can share on a screen and say, here's my thoughts, tell me what's right about this or tell me what's wrong about this, and where do we want to start together on actually doing some of these things to make a difference on this big, big complex problem. And what it really does nicely is make an explicit connection between those relationships between that thing you're trying to accomplish and what you actually think the impacts that are that you need to make in order to make that happen. So this is what a driver diagram looks like. And it's pretty simple when you actually come down to it. It's got your aim statement on the left-hand side, and then it's got your primary, secondary drivers, and your ideas for change, which are kind of those pieces of work that you actually can tangibly wrap your hand around and say, yes, I know what this means. I can achieve this, and this is what I'm going to do. So over on the right-hand side is more the causes and the things that you have uh, influence over. And if you do all of those things well, you should see the effect and impact more as you go to the left. So it's lots of little things on the right-hand side adding up to a big effect on the left-hand side. So the key part about this is starting with the aim statement. And the aim statement is really, what are you trying to achieve? What's that impact that you're trying to have? What is the problem we're trying to address? And so I've worked out a bit of an example as we go through the next few slides that builds out a driver diagram to address this aim. So the aim that I had written in the presentation was the reduction of long wait times in the emergency department. And now that I actually kind of look at that, I realize it's not a very good aim statement. So I should have used a SMART goal, so something that's specific, measurable, kind of aspirational, um, but yet realistic and timely. So there's an acronym called SMART, SMART, for how you should write a goal statement. So um, I should have actually done that. But I think if I was going to do that now, I would say the aim statement should have been something like, by June 30th of 2023, will achieve a 10% reduction of long wait times in the emergency department at Royal University Hospital. Like, scope it in, say this is what we're working on, put a time on it, put a improvement that you want to see in that statement, and that would have been much better than what I actually wrote there. So apologies for that, but good learning experience. So now that you know what your aim statement is, and usually the aim statement isn't particularly hard to come by, you kind of know what you want to achieve. Sometimes in a big, complex, wicked problem, it's harder to nail down because you do need to scope it to something you think you can actually kind of achieve and wrap your hands around. But that's usually not the hard part. The hard part is developing the drivers and the tests of change that you want to implement that you actually think will impact that aim. So there's lots of ways to do this. Um, One that we've used a lot in the work that I've done with the health system indicators and the performance measurement cascades is literature reviews. So whether that's you going on Google Scholar and just typing something in and seeing what comes up and starting to pull the information out, or leveraging the skills of a team like the research department at HQC to ask them if they could help with that, or the academics and learning team at the SHA to say, hey, can we get some of the SHA librarians to pull information on this? A literature review is a really good starting point to say, what do other people already know about this topic so that I'm not totally starting from scratch? Brainstorming is also a really good way to go about it. So getting a group of people together in a room or a virtual room to say, hey, if we want to solve and reduce emergency department waits, what are some of your ideas? What would we do? And put them up on sticky notes on a wall or on virtual sticky notes on a mural board. Just start getting some of those ideas out there. And then you can actually use something called an affinity diagram to build out the driver diagram, which is usually the way I go about it. So the brainstorming gives you all kinds of ideas, and picture for a moment if there was 100 sticky notes up on the wall that are just kind of randomly dispersed in their different ideas. What you do in an affinity diagram exercise is start to put some of those sticky notes together that are themes. So you might notice that there's a theme on the social determinants of health or a theme on hospital occupancy. And you start to plunk some of those sticky notes together. And those usually end up being smaller themes that kind of relate to being a secondary driver. When you can start to group some of those smaller themes together into bigger themes, those tend to become your primary drivers. And so you can almost build out a driver diagram using sticky notes on a wall. And then all of those little sticky notes are actually your change ideas, those things on the right-hand side of the driver diagram. So kind of keep that in mind as a really good way to go about building these. What you can do either before you have a rough draft driver diagram or after is learn from content experts and other teams that have done work in this area. So sometimes it's really nice to be able to walk in with something that you know isn't that good, but at least it's something on paper that a content expert can then look at and go, no, I disagree with that, and I would take this out, and you're missing this. Sometimes that's way easier than staring at a blank piece of paper and going, tell me about ED weights and where would you start in improving them. So that's again something I learned from Intermountain was that it's better to come in with something that you know is kind of wrong that they can poke holes in because it's a starting point for the conversation, as opposed to some people kind of get stuck looking at a blank sheet of paper and don't know where to start. So that's kind of a learning that we've had. And then, of course, there's lots of teams that have worked on these things. So, for example, the emergency department wait um, example that I'm kind of running through, there was actually an ED waits and patient flow team in the province. And there's people that know a ton about emergency department waits within Saskatchewan, and we can leverage their knowledge if we were actually building this out to scope a project. So I'm going to continue building out this driver diagram. So with our aim statement, the next thing we would do is figure out what our primary drivers are, and kind of going through those methods that I talked about on the last slide. We want to make sure that our primary drivers are those main key factors that we think would have a direct impact on the aim. They're kind of the key leverage points that if we do this really well, if we did all of those drivers really well, we should achieve our aim. So for reducing ED wait times, let's say, for example, the primary drivers would be what's the occupancy in our hospitals, what is the volume of people actually coming to the emergency department, and then how are we actually functioning within the emergency department, and is there some ways we could improve that process as well. For the secondary drivers, it's those things that are a little bit smaller in scope than the primary drivers that we think locally we could work on, and if we achieve those, we should start to see some bigger outcomes start to move. These are usually processes and bits of work that we think we can, again, improve at a local level. So if we were talking about ED wait times at Royal University Hospital, we've got our primary drivers, but it's really hard to say, okay, let's just go reduce hospital occupancy. But now with our second drivers, we've got some ideas around, well, at least if we reduced our length of stay for our patients or we reduce the number of admissions, those might be two ways of reducing or impacting our hospital occupancy. And you can see some other possible examples there for secondary drivers. Not to say this is perfect, and if there's folks out there, like I'm sure there's ED waits and patient flow former team members on the call that would look at this and go, boy, Doug, you're missing a lot. Yes, absolutely. This is just kind of meant as an example to walk folks through. But then what you do after you've had your secondary drivers kind of bucketed is you can plunk on those change ideas of what you actually think you can test and do at a local level to impact your secondary driver, which should impact your primary driver, which should, in theory, achieve the aim that you want to achieve. So, for example, if you want to reduce the alternate level of care days, and we worked on developing tiers of service for our medicine units throughout the province, that might have an impact on length of stay within a facility, which would impact occupancy, which would impact our overall emergency department wait times. One of the other things that I want to mention while I'm on this slide is that you can leverage those same research methodologies to figure out which one of these drivers you actually might want to focus on and build a strategic plan. So, for example, I think through the emergency department waits and patient flow work, it became pretty clear that if we improve the service that we give in the community and we support people closer to home and they have access to what they need, that is the best way to keep people from needing an admission to hospital. But if we also have those same proper services in the community, it's the best way to get people out of the hospital quicker and back home where they're more likely to recover well as opposed to staying in the hospital longer. So based on the work that they did, the knowledge that they had, you might actually just want to focus on this one middle primary driver of the volumes presenting to ED and build out your strategic plan for the year to maybe focus on access to primary care services. And what we would do on that this year is around virtual care. That's how you might scope out and build your strategic plan and not try and do everything on here because that's where you don't really achieve too much because with too many priorities, nothing's a priority and it's really hard to move work forward. So that's, in my mind, how you go about using a driver diagram to really build a strategic plan and drive the change. And again, use content experts, use research to say what might be the biggest bang for my buck. Or as a former CEO of the Saskatchewan Health or the Saskatoon Health region would say, and then Patrick is always kind of reminding me of it too, is what is that triple word score? Like that one change idea that might impact a whole bunch of these secondary drivers, because that might be where you want to start. One key piece of work will have a big impact on a bunch of things. So if you can find pieces of work like that, those are usually really good places to start. So why are driver diagrams important and why can we use them to solve these problems? Because if we don't, the system will just continue to work how it works. And we need a way of saying, how are we going to kind of make a dent in the system, change something, do something differently? We need to redesign that system so that we get a different result. Otherwise, we'll continue to always see long emergency department wait times. So the driver diagram is really a way of making a visual representation about how we think we can implement and actually make that change. So there are some tips on how to make a driver diagram. One is to be really clear about the aim. The better aim that you have, it allows you to understand what your scope is and say, yep, that's part of the work that we should do, or no, that's not quite in the scope. We'll leave it for another project at another time. It will get messy. So as I was kind of saying about that triple word score, sometimes you have change ideas or secondary drivers that attach to many, many, many things. And that's okay. Just know that it's not going to be a perfect look like I kind of gave on the last few slides just to run through the example. It doesn't have to be a perfect driver diagram. So very much aware that these are not supposed to be like, hey, this is the be all end all way to end ED waits. They're really meant to be a conversation starter so that you can say, here's some ideas and here's the change ideas that we have on how we could do this. Is it right? Do you think this resonates? Where would you like to start? Are we missing something? And then you can go from there. And it is something that is meant to be kind of reviewed and updated regularly. So it again shouldn't be, hey, we created this driver diagram in 2016, I'm going to dust it off, let's go implement it. You might want to dust it off and say, is it right? Can we change some things? And then go have those conversations. But it's meant to be a living document that maybe what you had for a secondary driver actually has no impact on the aim, but now you learn from it and you take it out and you add something new in. And then again, kind of being the measurement guy, where I really like driver diagrams is it's really easy to figure out what you should be measuring when you have a good driver diagram. So for example, this was our kind of basic blank driver diagram. You can usually attach a measure to each of these different pieces. So the aim statement, the primary drivers, and the secondary drivers. And if you've got good, clear drivers, it's usually really easy to say, this is how I would measure that. So here's a bit of a different example. And this one's a better aim statement. At least it's got a date in it. It's got a percent improvement that we want to see. So that's a good start. So this one is around reducing the number of preventable deaths in hospital by 5% by June of 2025. Made up, not part of our strategic plan, but I just want to use it as an example. Primary drivers on this one, incidence of sepsis and patient falls. Secondary driver around sepsis might be actual proper use of the sepsis bundle. And some change ideas would be one, increasing the use of the sepsis bundle, and two is training for employees to know how to use the sepsis screening tool in the bundle. So really simple driver diagram, but because it's kind of simple and well articulated, you can attach measures to it. So our aim statement, and like this is going to sound almost silly when I say these things, but that's the point. It should be easy to figure out your measures. So if our aim is reducing the number of preventable deaths, we should probably measure the number of preventable deaths. If our primary driver is the incidence of sepsis, we should measure the sepsis rate. If our drivers around using the bundle, we want to measure something around the number of patients that receive the bundle after a positive screening, and you'd want a target of 100%. Or if this was like totally brand new, maybe you'd set a target of 50% by this date and 75% by that date and up to 100 by this date. Like grow and learn along with your people along the way. It's really hard to go from 0 to 100 right away. And then you can measure your change ideas too. So you can measure the percentage of staff that's trained on how to do the sepsis screening. So this is a simplified way, but a really good way of visualizing how you can attach measures to a driver diagram to understand if the changes that you have implemented are actually impacting what you want them to. And this is one of my favorite memes of Yoda saying, measure everything you cannot. So you'll notice I didn't hang a measure on every little piece of that last driver diagram. You can, if you wanted to, say this is what I would measure for all of them. But you should really just focus what you're actually asking teams to measure and what you're asking digital health or e-health or the ministry to pull for data on the pieces of work that you're actually working on and what you're trying to implement. Because if you try and measure everything, it takes a lot of people's time. Sometimes you lose a little bit of that goodwill of, yeah, I don't mind filling out this 1 or 2 minute survey or something because I know it's important. But if I have to do 6 of those different things and I'm not seeing how they're used, then it becomes less likely that people will want to work with you and engage with you on some of this measurement stuff going forward because they know you're asking for everything and not actually using it. Sometimes, though, I would highlight that if you want to measure along that path on the driver diagram of what you're actually working on, you may want to pick 1 or 2 other things to measure that are balancing measures to say, hey, we're working on these processes, but am I having any negative impacts on something else? So, for instance, if we were looking at hospital occupancy and length of stay, if I've got a project and we're working on reducing length of stay and I can kind of measure the work that we're doing there, I might want to also measure 30-day readmissions to make sure that, yeah, we're reducing length of stay and getting people home quicker, but they're turning right around and coming back to us and getting readmitted. So that's kind of how the balancing measure would work on something like that. So something to always kind of keep in the back of your mind. So how have we actually used this tool within the health authority? And I think in a future QI Power Hour, myself and a few of my teammates are going to come back and talk through the health system indicators and the performance measurements cascades and the work that we do there and how they were developed in partnership with the ministry and in partnership with HQC, how we're now using them to inform strategic planning, how we're using them to engage with our board on some longer term visioning. Driver diagrams are the basis of all of that, but that's a conversation I'm excited for, but I think we'll come back another time. But what I am going to focus on and show you what we've used a driver diagram for is the surgical wait time priority in the province. So it's something that's been in the news. It's very public. Through COVID, our surgical wait times increased from being high before, honestly, to quite high now because we had to slow services down to make room for patients that needed ICU and acute space for their COVID stays. And so we need to figure out how to reduce that backlog back to 0 and then actually get our wait times from being sometimes well over 24 months down to 3 months by the time 2030 comes around. So we do have some shorter term outcomes we're trying to achieve in this. We're trying to do 97,000 surgeries this year within the health authority. Normally, I think we're funded for about 89,000. So it's about a 10% increase over what normal baseline used to be. So that in itself is a major piece of work, and there's lots of factors that need to go into that. Then we do have this target around nobody waiting longer than 24 months. And I think there's like 2,200 people in the province right now that are on that wait list for longer than 24 months. So how do we get them in and through? How do we still keep up with getting our cancer surgery and urgent surgeries done in a timely fashion? And then how do we start planning for next year to actually do 103,000 procedures? So lots going on in this space, kind of a wicked problem in that there's many, many things to consider. And the tool that we use to try and wrap our heads around it is a driver diagram. And yes, I'm aware you can't see the content on there, and that's okay. It's not necessarily about what the content is. It's about showing that we can actually use the same concept to solve some really major problems. So the aim statement on there that you can't quite see that's in kind of that pink box is around surgical wait times of no longer than 3 months by 2030. And we've got 4 primary drivers, I don't know, 7 or 8, maybe 10 secondary drivers, like 20 some third level drivers. And then in the blue are the change ideas that have come out of the engagement that we've done. So one thing this highlights is that the bigger the problem, sometimes the bigger the driver diagram needs to be. And it's okay to have third level drivers and maybe even fourth level drivers before you start getting into some of your change ideas. It just gives you a lot more things to think through and try and figure out. So would always be happy to chat about the work that we've done in this space. If you want to chat offline, I won't go super in depth in it. But this is work that was done over the course of about a month and a half with the Surgical Executive Committee, which is made up of members from the Ministry of Health, and then the surgical and physician leaders within the SHA, and then Michelle Schmallenberg, who's my ED, and myself, and Kelsey Kevinson have kind of the privilege of sitting at that surgical executive and working with them as they're planning supports to try and achieve these very lofty and large goals that they have. So again, looking at this, way too much to bite off, way too much to do if you tried to do all of it in 1 year. But what we did was this bit of a prioritization exercise that I think falls really nicely out of a driver diagram. So what we did was take all of those third level drivers, if I go back 1 slide, everything that's in green there, so I think there's like 20 some of them. And what we did was take them and kind of split them out and have them be their own little virtual stickies on a mural board. So each of those green boxes you can see on my screen, that the type is kind of blurry, that's a virtual sticky note. And what we did was use this um, tool that's on the right-hand side of the screen to say, okay, now that we've got these 20 some third level drivers of work that we know is important that we need to do we need to do them immediately in Q3 or Q4 of 2021? And yes, that got sideswiped by COVID pretty heavily, but ignore the dates. The concept is still the same. We kind of worked through it recently, but we went over and dropped some of the ones that we thought were immediate priorities into that box, and then moved the other ones over into the longer term strategies of like kind of near longer term, middle longer term, and like a long way out. And using that, we could scope our work for the upcoming year. So what we did was take the things that were in this immediate, yeah, we need to focus on these right away, and rank them by impact and the number of resources needed to do them. And where we started was kind of these quick wins. I think I'm trying to read the chat, but it's really hard to do that at the same time, quite honestly. But I feel like Jason had a comment about sometimes finding those quick wins. Absolutely right. And that's what we did with this, of these ones that were kind of down here in the bottom corner of high impact, but really easy to do. We started with some of those, and were able to piece out, I think it was kind of 5 of these key drivers that we wanted to focus on in this fiscal year to be foundational pieces of work to achieve that longer term strategy of reducing surgical waits by 2030. We will go back at some point and do something very similar with these longer term ones and continue to use that to develop our strategies over the next 5, 7, 10 years, honestly. So this is where we landed in developing that plan for 22, 23, and it's a much simplified driver diagram, but still big pieces of work, but it very much came out of that last gigantic driver diagram and the prioritizing that we did through there. So our aim statement for this year is around that 97,000 surgeries. So our primary drivers are around extending the capacity, coordinating our services better, expanding the use of third parties, and then engaging with our physician and patient partners to help develop these plans and share the work that we're actually doing so that our physicians and the public know what we're up to, why it's important, and can have them on board as we implement some of these changes. And then I actually start in red the pieces that are specifically part of the work that is on our SHA roadmap for this year. And lots of it's part of the orthopedic model line that my team is helping support. Kelsey Kevinson's our lead support on that, and she's kind of overseeing and helping plan what these different teams are going to do to make an impact on orthopedic services in the province. Again, very much in partnership with the Ministry of Health, and thankful for their support on that stuff. You do see one green check mark on there. That was that easy, quick win in the bottom of that prioritization matrix, and that was around establishing a steering committee and a structure for information flow and decision making, which really wasn't too hard. We had made the surgical executive committee, we partnered with the ministry, and we've got good structures in place now to make decisions and move work forward. So yeah, sometimes the quick wins are good, but it feels good to see a check mark on there. And this is a little bit about what that work plan actually looks like in the roadmap. So the surgical team and the EDs and their directors and their managers have actually come back, and we've got a really good plan to do 97,164 surgeries this year if all goes well, which exceeds the target of 97,000. You can see on the chart here what our projections are per month and how much they're increased from past years. You can see the purple line is the COVID year from last year and how much of an impact that was on surgical volumes. But excited to use data and measurement to track our progress as we go along and kind of plot the dots over this dotted green line to show where we are and share that with our leadership team in case they see that we're a little off track, they can do some course correction. We did a really detailed health and human resources gap analysis to say the big barrier in doing 97,000 surgeries is our human resources. And one, we need to take care of our people and give them time to have vacation and kind of recharge and refresh from the pressures of COVID over the last 2 years. But we also just need to hire more people because we don't have enough people to actually do 97,000 surgeries. So there's a really good HR plan in place that they've kind of chunked out quarter by quarter to say we want to hire this many nurses and support staff, et cetera, in Q1, Q2, and throughout the year to get there. And then, as I mentioned, we've launched this orthopedic model line with 3 kind of specific goals and outcomes that fell out of that big driver diagram around coordination, optimizing capacity, and then optimizing the health and human resources needs. So um, yeah, this is how the plan actually fell out and has become tangible out of that gigantic thing that was a couple slides ago. So it's exciting to see. And with that, I think I'm at the end of my content. And a former director of HQC, Sherry Furness, basically, she would always review my PowerPoints and would say that there's not enough animals, there's not enough pets. So I had to work one in just on behalf of Sherry. So that's the dog with the question at the back. And then my email's at the bottom. If anyone ever wants to reach out, myself or my team is always happy to chat about this stuff. So yeah, I'll pause for questions, or Tracy, maybe pass it back to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Doug. I know Sherry would be proud of your animal photo at the end there. I have to say, driver diagrams, I think, are one of my favorite quality improvement tools as well. So I've been listening quite closely to the presentation, and thank you so much for all the detail you put in there. You've also done an admirable job of keeping track of the chat. So you've addressed a lot of the comments that have been made already about, kind of focus and finish, about using driver diagrams to identify, both the initiatives that might get you the biggest bang for your buck, but as well as what Jason suggests is, where are the things, the quick wins that can really get people engaged. So that's excellent. The one question that's still out there, and I think I appreciate you sharing the kind of surgical services driver diagram, because that was a bit more real world and a bit more messy, but is, how do we use this tool to help people see that intersectionality and that messiness? Do you have any tips for folks on how to do that?
I guess there's a few ways. So depending on what your drive diagram looks like, one way you can do it is to color code different things, or if it's a big driver diagram, to put little stickies on it to say, hey, this primary driver is a key social determinant of health, and that's actually going to be impacted by the healthcare sector, by justice, by social services. And you can kind of color code either the driver itself or little stickies on top of it to say like, yeah, there's kind of a key person or a key organization or a key portfolio that owns this one, or there's like three, and we need to figure out what that interdependency looks like, and we need to make sure that if we're developing work to address that driver, that we've got those folks at the table, because there's huge impacts on it. So yeah, there's an example of that maybe if we share those health system indicators in the cascades. There's one around health and well-being of the early years, and a ton of the stuff on that is actually related to the education system. And we helped design and build that driver diagram with the Ministry of Education because they're knowledge experts in that area. And there's some very shared drivers and pieces of work that we've kind of identified are, yeah, they're theirs and they're ours, and how do we work together on them? So yeah, color code, little stickies, really whatever works for you.
Mhm. Great, thanks. Yeah, I think one of the tips is, they probably shouldn't look neat. If your driver diagram is, crumpled and coffee stained and has things crossed out and arrows drawn in, you're probably on the right track.
Yeah,
Um, Another
very nice.
question out there related to, the differences between logic models and driver diagrams. So the question asks, are there any situations or projects you would recommend the use of a logic model over a driver diagram or vice versa? What are your thoughts on that?
I think you just need to pick the right tool that works for you in the situation. So I know some people like, I find a driver diagram to be a logic model. A logic model in my mind is just a way of logically laying out that you think thing A relates to thing B, which relates to things C. I know there's some different tools that kind of have boxes in that lay out thinking. One of my specialists, Temi, is kind of well versed in that stuff, and I still need to learn from her. But she's got a logic model that she uses that's not a driver diagram, but the concept's exactly the same. So it's really up to the person and what you're comfortable with. Like I know she likes that, happy that she uses it. I like driver diagrams. I happen to use them, but I think it really depends on what you like to see. But really, they're kind of the same in my mind. But I don't know, curious if you've got different thoughts or if folks in the chat have different thoughts.
Yeah, great. I was just checking, and there is a comment here from Trish. Logic models are more often used to visualize program theory. So, what's the theory behind your program delivery model? So, they may even be kind of complementary tools once you get to the idea of developing a program as a result, possibly of a driver diagram. That may be another tool you want to use. Thanks for that comment. I'm also catching up on the chat. Lots of thanks for your presentation. We do have a few minutes. We could probably do a couple more questions, maybe while folks are are thinking of what they want to ask, I'll throw one out there. Um, One of the things that struck me as you were talking is, the potential of a driver diagram to really be a collaboration tool. And so, when you showed some of those driver diagrams, especially when you're thinking about really wicked problems, as you talked about earlier, that to me could be a way for, a really diverse group of people to kind of get behind a common aim and also see themselves in it and see what they could do to achieve it. So I'm just wondering, I know you talked a bit at the beginning about collaboration across portfolios and departments within the SHA. If you have any examples of where that's been a useful tool for that.
Sure. So, I mean, one of those for sure is that health and well-being in the early years cascade that we developed. So, one of the, again, I go back to Intermountain all the time, but one of the really key learnings from there is that when you're trying to solve a problem or improve a process, it's super important to have literally everyone that's involved in that process or involved in solving that problem at the table when you're trying to figure out your driver diagram or what your logic model is and what solutions you want to implement. So knowing that the health and well-being in the early years cascade very much focuses on some healthcare related things from age 0 to 5 around vaccinations and being able to achieve, um, get timely service for things like autism screening and things like that. But that there's also a very large part of the education system around um, being ready and the things that they teach in the early years that can help prepare people well for the rest of their lives. That's probably my best example of two separate almost jurisdictions or different totally different types of business coming together to say how do we work together on this because we each have parts of the problem to solve. I feel like there was also some work that you might have been involved in, Tracy, that I don't know if it got off the ground. It was right before COVID. If they pulled together a table that was kind of justice and social services and health to say, here's a problem we want to solve and how do we work on it together. And that in my mind was going to be awesome. And I hope it still is a thing or comes back because that's the only way we really will improve lots of our healthcare outcomes is understanding social determinants of health and making sure that people kind of have those basic necessities of life that they need because when they don't, that's when they tend to have to use the health system. So I think that would have been a really good example of different sectors coming together to solve a problem. And whatever tool they might have used, maybe it would have been a driver diagram to say, we're going to focus on this problem. You build that driver diagram together, and now you all feel shared ownership because you contributed and you helped develop it and you can see yourself in it. And it's not just like, hey, Tracy and Doug sat in a room to solve this big complex problem, and here you go. Social services, we need you to do this. Really hard way to get anyone to do stuff. But that would be another example within the province that I was super excited about and hope it still kind of becomes a thing.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I think one that I could talk a little bit about that HQC is involved in is working with partners to address life promotion, and in particular with our First Nations partners, and trying to use the diagram tool to understand, the root causes and factors that feed into self-harm or suicide. And when you start to look at that, you really start to see the breadth of causes and issues that might feed into that, and also the opportunities for people to work together to make a difference. Because we know with really complex issues, there's no one solution that's going to solve it. When you come up with a list of things, you probably have to do all of those things to solve the issue, and so it really does help for people to see themselves in that. We've got a couple of questions here about whether the slides will be made available after the presentation. And so, yes, you'll be able to see those on HQC's website, saskhealthquality.ca. And I see a link has been put in the chat, so thank you for that. Someone is also looking forward to the presentation on measurement cascades, and I am as well. So we're looking forward to having you back, Doug. Any final questions before we move on? I'll give one more opportunity for that. While we give it a minute, I also appreciated, so I myself had the privilege of attending training at Intermountain Healthcare as well. And now as a leader, have to remember that advice about, measurement does cost time and it does cost money, and you're not able to measure everything. And so as leaders too, it's important to remember that and to identify which measures are critically important to identifying the success of the initiative. So I'm hoping you'll talk about that as well in your upcoming presentation.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, I think we've got one more question here in the chat. So I'll maybe go with that. Now, I'm not sure I understand the acronym that's been used here, so I might ask you to just comment in the chat. So it says, how do you think IMH compares to SHA in terms of readiness for change? Intermountain Health, thank you. Care to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say they're probably 20 or 25 years ahead of us on their journey, and that's just because they started 20 or 25 years ahead of us. So, I mean, their data systems are incredible. They've got an entire department built around using performance measurement data to support change and work with clinicians and leaders to understand their processes and look for opportunities for improvement. So, I mean, again, Brent James kind of said like we had to start somewhere, and I think he says it was like 1997 or 1998, and you just slowly start building towards the vision that you want to see. But I mean, their systems are so mature that they can measure basically everything that happens in their health system of wait times and how long it took for something to happen, and costs of drugs, costs of service, like payment through third-party insurance providers and all those things. And they've got the data analysts and the QI supports to filter through all of that and pull pieces out. But they've also built that culture where people are willing to understand where they might not be doing as well as they could be, and they seek out opportunities for improvement. So there's physicians that are just clamoring to get their data because they want to look through it and they don't want to be the one lagging behind. Like they want to be the leading edge of how they make things better in their department. So I think we can get there. Like I've definitely seen glimpses of it, but we just have a long way to go. And I mean, we are taking steps of getting better data systems and digital health and the SHA and HQC working together and eHealth to start to tie some of those stories together that used to be a bunch of disparate systems. Now we're starting to talk to each other and we can start to understand that patient journey. But like, boy, like from the second you walk in the door to Intermountain to the end of your care journey, they can tell you everything about it and look for opportunities for improvement, and they're excited to do it. We'll get there. We're just not there yet. But give us 20 or 25 years, maybe we will be, or maybe we'll have blown past them. You never know. One can dream.
Excellent. Thanks, Doug. Okay, I think we've got time for one last question here that's in the chat. So does your team sometimes use resources from or partner with organizations like Choosing Wisely, Healthcare Excellence Canada, or the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health in exploring best practices when developing the actions that come out of the driver diagram?
We do, and it's still an area we definitely need to get better at. But one example, there's one of the specialists on my team. His name is Brad Boutillier. He's supporting the immunoglobulin stewardship uh, project in the province right now, which is being done in partnership with Clinical Excellence. And I think Jason, who's been in the chat, is part of that as well. And so they've got their theories of change. We're partnered with Angie Palin, who's the Choosing Wisely lead for Saskatchewan, on that work and picking her brain on choosing wisely best practices, learning from clinical excellence about how they make some of those pathways and referral forms. And we're supporting it from kind of the project management strategic planning side of things. So it's a really good partnership and it's been successful. Like I think there's actually like hundreds of thousands of dollars towards millions of dollars that have been saved just this year because of the improvements in the stewardship around that specific piece of blood product. So now they're looking for a second project to take on, and Angie's involved in the selection committee for where we go next. So yeah, lots of ways we can learn and do it better, but in little pieces we sure are where we can.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Doug. And I think, just a really great example too of how shared methods and tools between partners working on common problems can really help us all kind of best use our skills and talents to address those bigger problems quicker and faster. All right. So just a few things in wrap up. Doug, you probably already know this and you might have socks already, but you as a QI Power Hour speaker will be eligible to receive this lovely pair of I Love QI socks. If you listening out there would like to be the recipient of these socks as well, you too can become a QI Power Hour speaker. Please visit our website to learn more or to pitch us an idea. We'd love to hear from you. You will also, when you leave the webinar, you will be offered a chance to fill in a post-webinar survey. You'll see something pop up on your screen similar to what you're seeing on the screen now. It's just a warning that it's taking you to our external survey provider. It's fine, it's completely safe to click on, and we'd ask that you please take a few moments to complete that survey, as we do use that information regularly to continuously improve QI Power Hour. Next month, we'll hear from our colleague at HQC, Alvin Yap, on an introduction to program evaluation. So please be sure to register and tune in for that next session happening on May 20th. And so with that, I'll again give my thanks to Doug, and thanks to all of you for your questions and your participation in the chat, and bid you all farewell. Until next time, take care and stay safe, everyone. Thanks so much.